The moment I saw my son-in-law standing on my front porch, this man who had spent 11 years making sure I couldn't see my own daughter, I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger, not even surprise, something quieter than that. Something that had been waiting a long time. I said, "Come in." And I meant every word of what came next. You have to understand what the years before that looked like. My name is not important to this story. What matters is that I spent 31 years as a registered nurse at Vancouver General, raised my daughter mostly on my own after her father passed from a heart attack when she was 9, and built a life, slowly, carefully, the way you build anything when you don't have a lot of margin for error. I bought my house in Burnaby in 2003, a modest place, 2 bedrooms, a small backyard with a Japanese maple. I planted myself. By the time I retired, I had a pension, some savings, and more than enough to live simply and well. My daughter, I'll call her my daughter because that's who she is no matter what happened, met him at a company Christmas party when she was 28. He was charming the way some men are charming when they need something from you. He laughed at everyone's jokes. He held doors. He sent me a birthday card the first year I knew him, signed with both their names. I noticed small things early on. The way he'd answer a question she was already halfway through answering. The way she'd glance at him before she laughed, like asking permission. But she was happy, or she said she was, and I told myself I was being an overprotective mother. I told myself that a lot. They got married in September, a small wedding in the Fraser Valley, bright day, yellow leaves starting to come in off the trees. I wore a blue dress and I danced at the reception, and I thought, this is what it looks like when things are fine. Within 8 months, the call slowed down, then stopped. He told her. She told me this years later, in pieces, that I was too involved, that I had opinions about everything, that I made her feel guilty for building her own life. None of that was untrue exactly, the way a half-truth is never fully untrue. I did have opinions, but I also drove 40 minutes in January snow to sit with her when she had a miscarriage. I also transferred money without being asked when their furnace broke in February. I also showed up every time. That part he didn't mention. The last conversation I had with my daughter before the silence was about a sweater. I had knitted it for her, something I'd been doing since she was small, and I dropped it off at their place. And he told me at the door that she was resting and couldn't come down. I said that was fine. I handed him the sweater. He looked at it the way you look at something you're already planning to throw away. She never called to say thank you. She always called to say thank you. I drove home and I sat in my kitchen for a long time without turning on the light. After that, there were months of silence, broken only by small moments, a like on a photo, a short text at Christmas, always worded the same way, always careful. I could feel him in every sentence she sent. I would write back, trying to say enough without saying too much, trying to keep the door open with one hand while not letting myself fall through it with the other. By the 2nd year, I stopped expecting the phone to ring. By the 5th year, I had learned to live with a shape in my life that I couldn't quite name. Not grief exactly, more like the feeling of a room that used to have furniture in it. I joined a book club. I took a watercolor class at the community center on Kingsway. I visited my sister in Kelowna twice a year. I had friends, good ones, the kind you accumulate slowly over decades of showing up. I was not lonely in the way people imagine when they think of a woman living alone, but I was missing something, and I knew what it was, and there was nothing I could do about it. 11 years passed. In the spring, 2 years ago now, my financial advisor suggested I look at downsizing. The Burnaby house had appreciated significantly. If I sold and moved somewhere smaller, I could free up a meaningful amount of equity, invest the difference, and have considerably more flexibility for my retirement. I thought about it for several months, and then I did it. I sold the house I'd lived in for over 20 years and bought a condominium in New Westminster. The 10th floor. A view of the river. More space than I needed, but not so much that it felt empty. I told almost no one about the move, which sounds odd until you understand that I had spent 11 years learning to keep my life small and private. My daughter didn't have my new address. She barely had my new phone number. I wasn't hiding, I just wasn't announcing. I had been in the new place for about 6 weeks when my neighbor in the hallway mentioned that someone had been asking about me at the front desk. She described a man, well-dressed, maybe late 40s. I thanked her and went inside and stood very still in my kitchen for a moment. 3 days later, my intercom buzzed. I looked at the screen, my son-in-law, and behind him, my daughter. She looked thinner than I remembered. She was wearing a coat I didn't recognize, and her hair was different, and she had her arms crossed in a way that looked less like cold and more like something else. He was standing slightly in front of her, the way he always stood. I pressed the button to let them up. I unlocked the door. I put the kettle on. When they came in, the first thing he said was that it was a beautiful place. He said it the way someone says it when they're calculating something. My daughter hugged me, and I held on longer than she expected. I felt her go still for a moment, and then something in her loosened, and she held on too. We sat in the living room. He did most of the talking. The story was this. He had been laid off 6 months earlier. A restructuring at his company, nothing he could have predicted or prevented. They had been managing, he said, but things had become difficult. Their lease in Port Moody was ending in 2 months, and they hadn't been able to secure a new place in time. And they needed, just temporarily, he said, just to get back on their feet, somewhere to stay. He said it was hard for them to ask. He said he knew there had been distance between us. He said he hoped we could put all of that behind us now. I looked at my daughter. She was looking at the coffee table. I said, "Of course, you can stay here." He smiled. My daughter looked up at me, and I saw something in her face that I couldn't fully read. Relief or guilt or both, layered together the way feelings get layered when you've been carrying them for a long time. What I did not say, sitting in that living room with my hands folded in my lap and the kettle just starting to whistle in the kitchen, was that I had already spoken to my lawyer. I should back up. When my neighbor mentioned the man at the front desk, I didn't panic. I had been a nurse for 31 years. You learn in that work to notice things without reacting to them immediately. You learn to sit with information while you figure out what to do with it. I called a friend of mine, a woman I've known since our daughters were in kindergarten together, whose ex-husband was an estate lawyer before he retired. She put me in touch with her former colleague, and I had a quiet conversation with him about a week before my son-in-law showed up at my intercom. What the lawyer told me wasn't alarming on its own, but it confirmed something I had already sensed. Under certain circumstances, if an elderly person becomes incapacitated, for example, or if they can be persuaded to sign documents without fully understanding them, a family member living in their home could potentially complicate the ownership of assets. It wasn't simple and it wasn't guaranteed, but it was possible. I asked what I should do if someone I didn't fully trust was about to move into my home. He told me. I also made a phone call I should have made years earlier. My daughter has a cousin, her father's nephew, who lives in Calgary. We had drifted apart after my husband died, but we had always liked each other, and he had gone into law enforcement. I won't say more about what we discussed, except that he agreed to look into something for me, quietly. And he called me back 4 days later with information that made the muscles in my jaw go tight. My son-in-law had a history, not a criminal record, not exactly, but a civil judgment in Ontario from 2014. A business partner who had successfully sued him for misappropriating funds from a small company they'd run together. The judgment had been settled, barely. He had moved west shortly after. He had never mentioned any of this to my daughter as far as her cousin could tell, and her cousin had spoken to her gently not long before all of this unfolded. She hadn't known. She had genuinely not known. That changed things. Not everything, but something. So when my son-in-law came into my home and sat on my sofa and spoke about fresh starts and putting things behind us, I was listening to two conversations at once, the one he was having and the one I already knew was coming. It took about 2 weeks. He was pleasant those first 2 weeks, helpful even. He fixed a hinge on one of my kitchen cabinets. He made coffee in the mornings without being asked. He was performing a version of himself that was designed to be disarming, and it almost worked, in the way a trick almost works when you're watching for it. My daughter, in those 2 weeks, was different. Quieter with him than I expected. She came into the kitchen one evening while I was making soup, and she sat at the counter and didn't say anything for a few minutes, just watched me stir. Then she said, "I missed this." I said, "I know." We didn't say anything else, but something passed between us that felt important. The conversation I had been waiting for came on a Saturday afternoon. My daughter had gone to meet a friend. The first time, I noticed, that she had done anything alone since they arrived. He came and sat across from me in the living room and told me he had been doing some thinking. He said that he was worried about me. Living alone, getting older, no immediate family nearby except for them. He said that it might make sense, just from a practical standpoint, to think about formalizing some things. He had done a bit of research, he said, and there were options. A joint tenancy arrangement on the condo, for example, might provide security for all of us. Or a power of attorney, just a limited one, so that if anything happened to me there would be someone who could act quickly on my behalf. He pushed a folder across the coffee table. There were documents inside. I looked at the folder. I looked at him. I said, "That's very thoughtful of you." I did not touch the folder. I said that I would need to have my lawyer review anything before I signed it, of course. I was sure he understood, just standard practice. A woman my age couldn't be too careful. I smiled when I said it. He smiled back. The air in the room had changed, though. He could feel that something wasn't moving the way he had planned. That evening, I called my lawyer. The next morning, I called my daughter's cousin in Calgary. By the end of that week, my lawyer had documented everything. The visit, the folder, the specific documents inside it, which included a power of attorney form that had already been partially filled out in my name. My daughter's cousin had passed information to someone he trusted in the Metro Vancouver Financial Crimes Unit. It wasn't my job to understand all of it. My job was to not sign anything and to keep steady. I want to tell you about the morning it ended because it matters how it ended. My daughter woke up early. I heard her in the kitchen before 7, and I got up and we sat together with our coffee before he was awake. She looked like someone who hadn't been sleeping well. She looked like someone who had been thinking. She said, "Mom, has he asked you about anything? About the condo?" Or, she stopped. I looked at her for a moment. I said, "What do you know?" And she told me. Not everything, she hadn't known everything, but she had found something on his laptop 3 days earlier, an email thread with someone I didn't know, discussing timelines and documents and what a sympathetic older woman might be willing to sign if she felt she had finally reconnected with her family. My daughter had been sitting with that for 3 days. She had not said anything to him. She had not left. I don't know what she was waiting for exactly. Maybe she needed to be sure, or maybe she was scared. Maybe both. She reached across the table and took my hand. She said, "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm sorry it took me so long." I said, "I know." 2 hours later, there was a knock at the door that was not a visitor I had invited. My son-in-law, when he came out of the bedroom and saw who was standing in my hallway, went very still. He looked at me. I looked back at him. There was nothing to say. He left that morning in a way that was not his choice. My daughter stayed. The weeks after that were not simple. I want to be honest about that, because the truth of things is rarely as clean as a story makes it sound. My daughter stayed in the spare room while she figured out what came next. We were careful with each other, the way you are when something fragile has been broken and you're not sure yet how much of it can be repaired. We had 11 years of silence between us, and a folder of documents on my coffee table that neither of us wanted to look at, and a lot of mornings of sitting in the kitchen not quite knowing where to start. We started anyway. She told me things, slowly, over weeks, about the years I hadn't seen, about the way he had worked at her, gradually, patiently, the way erosion works, so that by the time she noticed how much had been worn away, she couldn't quite remember what it had looked like before. She told me about the sweater. She said she had found it in a donation bag 3 days after I brought it. She had taken it out and kept it hidden in the back of a drawer for years. I told her I was glad she kept it. She started working again, remotely, through a contact she had from before. She found a place in Coquitlam, not far from me. On Sundays, we have taken to driving out to the valley, sometimes just for coffee, sometimes to walk somewhere green. She is quieter than she used to be, but she laughs the same way. I had forgotten the exact sound of it. My lawyer tells me that the civil process will take time. The Financial Crimes Unit is involved, and there are proceedings I don't need to understand in detail. Justice, in the legal sense, moves at its own pace, and I have learned not to measure my peace by where that process is on any given day. What I will say is this: I am 67 years old. I worked every hard shift I was given. I raised my daughter without asking the world to make it easy. I bought a house, and then I bought another one, and I tended both of them the way you tend anything you love, steadily, over time, without expecting applause for it. I built something, and I am still here, in my apartment on the 10th floor, watching the river out the window, with my Japanese maple now in a large pot on the balcony, because I couldn't leave it behind. Some people, when they heard pieces of this story, asked me how I could have let them in at all, why I didn't turn them away at the intercom and be done with it. I understand why they ask, but I knew what I was doing when I pressed that button. I knew what I was walking into, and I walked in anyway, because my daughter was standing behind him in that hallway with her arms crossed and her face closed. And I recognized something in her that I had seen a long time ago in a hospital corridor when I was a young nurse. That specific stillness of someone who has been in survival mode for so long they've forgotten there's another way to stand. I wasn't letting him in. I was letting her know the door was open. She walked through it when she was ready. That's all I was waiting for.